Arthur Harrington was 52 years old, and until 3 months ago, he thought he knew everything about his wife of 27 years. He was wrong, dead wrong, and the secret she'd been keeping every Wednesday for 2 decades would shake their marriage to its core and resurrect a betrayal he thought they'd buried 18 years ago. It started the way most suspicions do, with something small, something so insignificant that most people would brush it off. But once Arthur noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. Beatrice left the house every Wednesday at exactly 9:51 a.m. Not 9:45, not 10 o'clock, 9:51, like clockwork. For 20 years, Arthur was a senior engineer at a large software firm outside Boston, the kind of job that paid the bills but didn't make headlines. Beatrice worked part-time as a librarian for a community college. Flexible hours that let her manage her own schedule. They lived comfortably in their four-bedroom house in Concord. Not rich, but stable. 2 kids, both in graduate school now, a decent life, an honest life, or so Arthur thought. The Wednesday routine hadn't bothered him for years. Everyone has their patterns, right? Beatrice said she visited her mother, went to the farmer's market, took a pottery class occasionally. Normal stuff. He'd been working from home more often since the restructuring, and that's when he started noticing the precision of it all. 9:51 a.m. Every single Wednesday, she'd grab her leather tote, check her messages, and disappear for exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes. He'd timed it without meaning to, his analytical brain automatically tracking patterns. At first, Arthur felt ridiculous for even paying attention. This was Beatrice, his B, the woman who'd stood by him through his sister's illness, through the startup failure in 2018, through their son's difficult adolescence. The woman who still left him sticky notes on his monitor and remembered how he liked his tea. But something nagged at him, something he couldn't quite name. Then came the Wednesday morning that changed everything. It was mid-December, unusually mild for Massachusetts. Arthur had called in sick to work, a severe migraine that had kept him awake most of the night. Beatrice had been attentive, bringing him painkillers and a cold compress, checking his temperature. Around 9:35 a.m., she came into the bedroom, already dressed in her tailored slacks and the emerald green jacket he'd bought her last anniversary. "I'm heading out for a bit, darling," she said, her voice casual. "Need anything while I'm out?" Arthur shook his head, watching her from the bed. "Where are you going?" The question hung in the air for half a second too long. Beatrice's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just the usual. Running errands." "Which usual errands, Arthur?" She laughed, but it sounded strained. "Since when do you quiz me about my pottery class?" "I'm not quizzing. I'm asking. Mom's appointment, dry cleaners, maybe grab some tea." She kissed his temple. "I'll be back around 1. She left at 9:51. "I am exactly." Arthur lay there for 15 minutes, his head pounding with something that had nothing to do with the migraine. Her mother's appointment? But her mother's physical therapist only came on Fridays. Beatrice hadn't stepped foot in a professional ceramic studio in years, as far as he knew. Why would she go every Wednesday? He got out of bed, moving carefully on shaky legs. Through the bedroom window, he watched Beatrice's charcoal gray Subaru Forester pull out of the driveway. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time, and he'd been too comfortable, too trusting to see it. Arthur grabbed his phone and pulled up their banking app. Joint checking account, normal activity, groceries, utilities, the usual stuff. Savings account, steady, nothing unusual. He checked their credit card statements next, scrolling through weeks of transactions. Everything looked normal. Standard purchases, reasonable amounts, nothing that screamed affair or secret stock trading problem or any of the things his mind was racing toward. But if everything was normal, why did his gut feel like it was tied in knots? He thought about his college roommate's words from 8 years ago at a reunion after too many whiskeys. "Man, you're lucky Beatrice is so steady. My ex-wife had a secret investment portfolio I didn't find out about until the divorce. 35,000 in losses." Can you imagine? Arthur remembered laughing it off, defending Beatrice, saying she'd never do something like that. And he'd believed it, still believed it. Beatrice wasn't reckless. She was careful, organized, methodical. That was one of the things he'd always loved about her. But methodical people don't drive somewhere every Wednesday for 20 years without a reason. If you enjoy stories of shocking family secrets, hidden betrayals, and the cold-blooded truth that tears marriages apart. Like this video and kindly subscribe to the Ebon Stories channel now. There are brand new stories here every day that you will enjoy, each one more intense than the last one you watched. And tell me where you are watching from and what is interesting about your city. Arthur made a decision. Maybe it was the fever making him reckless. Maybe it was 27 years of building trust that needed to be validated. Or maybe it was the tiny, terrible voice in the back of his mind that had been whispering for months that something wasn't right. He was going to follow her next Wednesday. The week crawled by. Arthur went to work, came home, had dinner with Beatrice, watched a documentary beside her on the couch. Everything was normal. Beatrice was Beatrice, warm, attentive, occasionally distracted by her tablet, but no more than usual. They talked about their daughter's thesis defense, their son's new job offer, the gutter repair they needed to schedule. Ordinary life, ordinary marriage. But Arthur couldn't stop thinking about Wednesdays. He started paying closer attention. On Thursday, Beatrice mentioned she needed to update her passport. Friday, she complained about the cost of auto insurance. Saturday night, they went out to dinner at their favorite seafood restaurant, sharing a bottle of wine and joking about the awkward silence from the couple across the room, who were clearly on a disastrous blind date. Beatrice held his hand across the table, her thumb tracing patterns on his knuckles, the way she'd done since they were engaged. "You okay?" she asked. "You've seemed distant lately." "Just project pressure," Arthur lied. "The new launch schedule's been intense." "You work too hard." She squeezed his hand. "Promise me you'll delegate more." He promised and hated himself for lying. Ari throat. Tuesday night, Arthur barely slept. He lay beside Beatrice, listening to her quiet breathing, watching the gentle movement of her shoulders in the darkness. Who was this woman? Did he really know her at all? Or had he been sleepwalking through their marriage, assuming intimacy meant truth? Wednesday morning arrived cool and foggy. Arthur called his team lead at 7:45 a.m., saying he needed to work from home for the day. A security audit that required privacy and focused attention. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did have meetings scheduled, but he moved them to the late afternoon. Beatrice made them breakfast, oatmeal and berries, chatting about a funny news story their son had shared. She was wearing different clothes than usual. Not her typical gardening clothes or workout gear, but dark trousers and a sapphire blue silk shirt. Nice clothes, clothes you'd wear if you wanted to look professional. "You look sharp," Arthur said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "This old shirt," Beatrice laughed. "I have a committee meeting with Jane later. Didn't want to look sloppy." Jane, her colleague from the library? That checked out. Or did it? Arthur realized he hadn't actually spoken to Jane in months, maybe years. At 9:49 a.m., Arthur was in his home office, positioned where he could see the driveway through the window. His laptop was open to a code review he wasn't actually reading. His car keys were in his pocket. His heart was thudding against his ribs. 9:51 a.m., right on schedule, Beatrice walked out the front door, tote over her shoulder, phone in hand. She climbed into her Subaru, backed out of the driveway, and headed south toward the highway. Arthur waited exactly 60 seconds. Then he grabbed his bomber jacket and followed. He kept 4 cars back, feeling ridiculous and paranoid and terrified all at once. This was his wife, his partner, the mother of his children. And here he was tailing her like a novice PI in a mediocre thriller. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was this close to understanding what the hell had been happening. Every Wednesday for 20 years, Beatrice's car turned onto Route 2, then merged onto I-95 South. Arthur's pulse quickened. She was heading toward the greater Boston area, toward the dense cluster of financial buildings and high-end services. She passed the highway exit for the college, passed the exit for her mother's town, kept driving. Then she pulled into a parking garage Arthur knew well, too well, the garage beneath the Sterling Tower complex in downtown Boston. She'd been telling the truth about needing to go downtown. But why? Arthur parked in a nearby municipal lot, positioning himself where he could watch the tower entrance without being obvious. Beatrice got out of her car, adjusted her shirt, and walked inside. Not rushed, not nervous, like she'd done this 1,000 times before, because she had every Wednesday for 20 years. Arthur checked his watch, 10:15 a.m. He'd give her 30 minutes. If she came out in 30 minutes, maybe this was nothing. Maybe she had some perfectly rational explanation. Maybe he was being paranoid and stupid, and he'd owe her the world's biggest apology. But something told him 30 minutes wouldn't be enough. He was right. An hour passed, then an hour and a half. Arthur sat in his car watching the tower entrance, his mind spinning through possibilities. Was she accessing a safe deposit box? Meeting someone there? Working with a lawyer on some secret estate matter? The rational part of his brain kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation. The other part, the part that remembered how she'd hesitated when he asked where she was going, wasn't so sure. At 11:32 a.m., Beatrice emerged from the Sterling Tower. But she wasn't alone. A man walked beside her, tall, maybe late 50s, with impeccably groomed gray hair and an expensive-looking Italian suit. They weren't touching, but there was something about their body language, the way they moved in sync, the familiarity of their distance that made Arthur's blood run cold. They stood outside the entrance for another minute talking. Beatrice smiled genuinely at something the man said, her hand briefly gesturing toward the building. The interaction looked professional, comfortable, like they'd been colleagues for a long time. Then Beatrice shook the man's hand, a brief, firm grasp, and walked back toward the garage. The man watched her go before heading toward a sleek black Tesla sedan parked nearby. Arthur's hands were gripping the steering wheel. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. This didn't necessarily mean what it looked like. Maybe the guy was just a business contact, a financial advisor, someone helping her with some legitimate investment that required meeting every single Wednesday for 2 decades. Even in his own head, it sounded ridiculous. Beatrice's car pulled out of the garage, heading back toward the highway. Arthur didn't follow her, not yet. Instead, he watched the silver-haired man get into his Tesla. The guy sat there for a moment reviewing his tablet and then drove off in the opposite direction toward the harbor. Arthur made another snap decision. He followed the Tesla. They drove for 20 minutes, leaving downtown Boston and heading toward the affluent North Shore suburbs. The neighborhoods got quieter, the houses bigger, the architecture more historical. Finally, the Tesla turned into the driveway of a grand Queen Anne-style home in an exclusive coastal town. Arthur had read about places like this in magazines, but never visited. The kind of neighborhood where properties started at $3 million. The man got out, grabbed a slim briefcase from the passenger seat, and walked into the house like he owned it because Arthur realized he probably did. Arthur sat in his car at the end of the long driveway, staring at the house. His phone buzzed. A text from Beatrice. "Traffic's terrible. Making shepherd's pie for dinner? Love you." He couldn't bring himself to respond. Instead, he pulled up the town property records on his phone. The address was listed under the name Julian Vance, owner since 2006. Occupation, commercial property investor. Estimated property value, $3.2 million. Julian Vance, the name meant nothing to Arthur. He'd never heard Beatrice mention anyone by that name, but they'd met at that tower complex every Wednesday for years. They had to be connected somehow. The question was, how and why? Arthur drove home in a haze, his mind trying and failing to construct innocent explanations. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Beatrice's car was already there. He could smell the roasting lamb through the front door, the family recipe, shepherd's pie, the comfort food she made when he was stressed. She greeted him at the door with a kiss. "There you are. I was starting to worry. How's the head?" "Better," Arthur managed. "Just needed some air in the car." Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly. "I saw you were gone. Drove out towards Walden Pond a few times. Helped with the throbbing." It was a terrible lie, but Beatrice just nodded, leading him into the kitchen. "Well, come eat. This will fix you right up." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd had thousands of meals over 27 years. Beatrice chatted about her fictional committee meeting, about Jane's drama with the new database, about the terrible drivers on I-95. She was relaxed, natural, giving no indication that she just spent over an hour in a downtown high-rise meeting with a wealthy property investor Arthur had never heard of. Arthur played along, responding when appropriate, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, planning. He needed more information. He needed to understand what he'd seen before he confronted her because once he asked the question, Once he opened that door, there was no closing it again. After dinner, Beatrice kissed his cheek and said she had library work to catch up on. She disappeared into their small study, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts and the remains of the pie. Neither of them had finished. He pulled out his phone and opened a new search. Julian Vance, Boston. The results loaded slowly, each second feeling like an hour. What Arthur found made his stomach drop. Julian Vance was more than just a wealthy investor. He'd been involved in a major municipal bond deal 18 years ago, a deal that had gone sour spectacularly. Arthur clicked through article after article, piecing together a story he had half forgotten. A town infrastructure project that had failed, investors losing millions, lawsuits flying in every direction. It had been all over the Boston news in 2006, 18 years ago. And then Arthur remembered his hands went cold. 18 years ago, Beatrice's father had died suddenly, a stroke at 65. It had devastated Beatrice, sent her into a grief that lasted months. Arthur had been there for every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of sorrow. But there had been something else that year, something about her father's finances. Arthur stood up and walked to their bedroom, to the antique desk where they kept important documents. He rifled through folders until he found the one marked Estate. Thomas Sterling, Beatrice's father. The papers were old, brittle at the edges. Arthur scanned through them looking for something he'd never paid attention to the first time. Most of it was standard retirement accounts, life insurance payout, modest property transfer to Beatrice and her brother. Nothing unusual. Then he found it, a single document tucked between the last two pages. A personal guarantee signed by Thomas Sterling, dated July 2005 for $250,000 made out to Julian Vance Investments. Arthur sank onto the bed, the paper trembling in his hands. His father-in-law had guaranteed a loan to Julian Vance for $250,000, and from the date, it looked like that guarantee had been tied to the failed municipal bond deal that had collapsed. Thomas Sterling had been an investor, one of the people who'd lost everything. But he'd signed a personal guarantee, which meant he'd been liable for Vance's loan personally. And then he died less than a year later, leaving Beatrice and her brother to deal with the aftermath. The Wednesday suddenly made sickening sense. Beatrice had been paying off her father's debt for 20 years. Every Wednesday at 9:51 a.m., she'd been meeting with Julian Vance at that tower, making payments, keeping a secret that would have changed everything Arthur thought he knew about their marriage. But the math didn't add up. 20 years of payments, even small ones, should have cleared $250,000 by now. Unless there was interest, unless there were penalties, unless Beatrice had been paying the bare minimum just to keep Vance from to King legal action against their father's estate, against their family. Arthur's mind raced through the implications, the sacrifices. Beatrice must have MID, the extra shifts at the library, the way she'd always been so careful with money, so insistent they didn't need lavish holidays or premium cabla. He'd thought she was just thrifty, but she'd been carrying a crushing debt in secret, protecting him and their children from a burden that wasn't even hers to bear, and she'd never told him, not clear his throat, once in years. Arthur heard footsteps in the hallway. Beatrice appeared in the doorway, stopping when she saw him sitting on, headed with the estate folder open beside him. Her face went pale. "Arthur, how much do you still owe him?" Arthur's voice came out flat, controlled, dangerous. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "I can explain how much, Beatrice." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had broken behind them. Something that had been holding back the weight of 2 decades, $250,000 by now. Unless there was interest, unless there were penalties, unless Beatrice had been paying the bare minimum just to keep Vance from the King legal action against their father's estate, against their family, Arthur Smith raced through the implication as the sacrifices Beatrice must have the extra shifts at the library, the way she'd always been so careful with money, so insistent they didn't need lavish holidays or premium cabli. Itishawam. Didula thought she was just thrifty, but she'd been carrying a crushing debt in secret, protecting him and their children from a burden that was Tevin Hairstow Bear, and she never told him not clear his throat once in 20 years. Arthur heard footsteps in the hallway. Beatrice appeared in the doorway, stopping when she saw him sitting on his bed with the estate folder open beside him. Her face went pale. Arthur, how much do you still owe him? Arthur's voice came out flat, controlled, dangerous. Beatrice, she is filled with tears. I can explain how much, Beatrice. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had broken behind them, something that had been holding back the weight of 2 decades. 62,000, the number hung between them like a sharp edge. After 20 years, Arthur said slowly, after all those Wednesdays, all those hours, all those payments, you still owe him $62,000. Beatrice nodded, tears streaming down her face now. The interest rate? Arthur, my father was cornered. The terms were usurious, 25% compounded quarterly. I've been paying him $4,000 every month for 20 years, and I've barely touched the principal. Arthur did the math. $4,000 a month for 20 years. That was $960,000. She'd paid Julian Vance $960,000 and still owed him $62,000 on an original liability of $250,000, nearly $1 million gone, and Arthur had never known. Why Bunba? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was terrified. Beatrice's voice broke. Because my father made a terrible mistake and I couldn't let our family lose everything. Vance threatened to sue the estate, to take my parents' house, to go after my brother. I couldn't let that happen. So I made a deal with him. 20 years of payments, I'd handle it myself. By lying to me for 2 decades. By protecting you, Beatrice shouted, then immediately lowered her voice. You just started your own company when this started. We had 2 small children, a large mortgage. I was working minimal hours. If I told you about this debt, what would you have done? Clear's throat. You would have tried to fix it. You would have drained our emergency fund, stopped funding the retirement, risked everything we were building. I couldn't let you do that. So you did it instead. You sacrificed 20 years, nearly $1 million, and our trust. For what? Beatrice walked to the bed and sat beside him, but maintained a physical distance. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 20 years pressing down on both of them. I need to know everything, Arthur said finally. No more secrets, no more lies. Tell me the whole story from the beginning. Beatrice took a shaky breath and began to speak. And as Arthur listened to his wife unravel 20 years of secrets, he realized that everything he thought he knew about their marriage had been built on a foundation of silence. The question now was whether that foundation could ever be rebuilt, or if Julian Vance's cruel deal had destroyed more than just their bank account. They had no idea that Arthur was already planning something that would finally end Beatrice's 20-year obligation, something that Julian Vance would never see coming. Because Arthur Harrington wasn't just a senior engineer. He'd spent his entire career solving problems, finding vulnerabilities, and exploiting loopholes in complex systems. And Julian Vance's predatory loan scheme, that was a system full of weaknesses. Arthur just needed to find them. Beatrice's story spilled out in fragments, 20 years of secrets tumbling into the space between them on their bed. Arthur listened without interrupting, his mind cataloging every detail, every date, every moment his wife had shouldered a burden she thought would crush their family if he knew. It had started in August 2006, 4 weeks after Thomas Sterling's funeral. Beatrice had been overwhelmed by grief, sorting through her father's orders with her brother when they'd found the guarantee. Their mother, already frail from losing her husband, had nearly collapsed when she understood what it meant. Thomas Sterling had invested a significant portion of his retirement, $250,000, in Julian Vance's bond fund. When the project collapsed, he'd been desperate to secure something, anything. Vance had offered a restructuring, a personal guarantee, with the promise that once Vance secured new capital and the project recovered, Sterling would be released from liability. The project never recovered. The capital never materialized. And Thomas Sterling died with $250,000 in liability to a man who had no intention of mercy. Vance showed up at the house, Beatrice said, her voice hollow. Can you imagine? He came to my father's memorial gathering, offered condolences, and then told me we needed to discuss Thomas's financial commitment. Like my father was a contract that needed enforcing. Arthur felt rage building in his chest, hot and sharp. He came to the house to intimidate. 3 days later, he sent a formal demand letter. The full amount plus accrued penalties due within 60 days. If we didn't pay, he'd file a lawsuit against the estate. Beatrice wiped her eyes. Mom would have lost the house. Dad had mortgaged the property heavily to invest in that fund. Between the guaranteed advance and the other creditors, there was nothing left. Negative net worth. If Vance sued, everything would have been seized. Mom would have been destitute. My brother was unemployed at the time. And you and we were trying to launch your new venture. So you made a deal. He called it a long-term servicing arrangement. 20 years fixed monthly payments of $4,000, 25% annual compound interest. He said it was merciful that most investors would have been far more aggressive. At the time, I didn't understand the math. I just knew I had to protect Mom, protect my brother, protect our family. Arthur's mind was already working through the numbers, the legal implications, the sheer exploitation of what Vance had done. How did you hide $4,000 a month from me? I took extra freelance work. Remember when I started offering my services to the local museum archives? That wasn't my only gig. I had 3 other remote contracts I never told you about. Small nonprofits that paid by invoice. I worked late into the night after you were asleep. During the day while the kids were in school, every penny I earned went straight to Vance. 20 years of chronic fatigue, 20 years of overworking herself to burnout, 20 years of lying about where she was every Wednesday morning. The tower meetings, Arthur said. Why there? Why every Wednesday? Vance's requirement. He wanted direct payments in person every week. Said it demonstrated commitment. The tower office was his base. He'd meet me in a private conference room. I'd hand over a certified check with the week's payment. He'd give me a sign and receipt and we'd both leave. $1,000 a week every Wednesday, like clockwork. For 20 years, Beatrice nodded. I thought I could pay it off faster. I thought if I took on enough work, saved enough, I could clear it in 12 years, maybe 15. But the compound interest kept consuming everything. Last year, I finally paid down enough that the interest started slowing down. I'm in the home stretch now, 15 more months, and it's over. 62,000 left, and then I'm free. Arthur stood up, pacing the bedroom. His wife had been living in a financial cage for 2 decades, and he'd been completely ignorant. Every time he'd suggested they treat themselves to something nice, every time he'd wanted to invest in a new project or take a long trip, Beatrice had gently steered them toward caution. He thought she was just risk-averse. He hadn't known she was pouring money into a predator who'd shown up at her father's memorial to collect. Why didn't you just tell me after a few years, Arthur asked. Once we were more secure. Once we could have handled it together, because by then I'd already built a mountain of lies. How do you confess that? How do you tell your husband, oh, by the way, I've been secretly paying $4,000 a month to a loan shark for 8 years. Don't worry about it. Every year that passed made the truth heavier. And every year I told myself I was almost finished. Just a little longer. Just one more year. I could handle it alone. Beatrice looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. I know I should have told you. I know it was wrong to keep this from you. But Arthur, I need you to understand. I did it because I love you. Because I couldn't bear the thought of this ripping us apart. Instead, you let it destroy your peace. The silence that followed was immense. Arthur walked to the window, looking out at their quiet suburban street. Comfortable homes, reliable cars, stable lives. Everyone operating by accepted social contracts. Except Julian Vance didn't play by any contract but his own. He'd built his multi-million-dollar estate on the backs of people like Thomas Sterling and Beatrice Harrington. People who invested with him, believed in him, and paid for that belief with their retirement funds, their time, their quality of life. I need to see the documentation, Arthur said finally. Every receipt, every payment record, every piece of paper Vance gave you, can you retrieve them? Beatrice hesitated. Why, Wayne? Because I'm not letting you make 15 more payments. I'm not letting that bastard take another dollar from our family. Arthur turned to face her. You've been fighting this alone for 20 years. That ends today. Now we fight together. Something shifted in Beatrice's expression. Resolve, maybe, or trepidation, possibly both. She walked to the large bookcase and pulled down a leather-bound journal from the top shelf. Inside were hundreds of small carbon copy receipts, each one typed and signed in the same corporate font, dated and authenticated by Julian Vance Investments. 20 years of evidence, carefully preserved. Arthur took the journal and began sorting through the receipts. Every Wednesday, $1,000 acknowledged and recorded. He pulled out his laptop and started building a complex spreadsheet, entering dates and amounts, calculating the actual interest paid versus what should have been paid on a legal agreement. The numbers told a story that made his blood run cold. Make sure you're subscribed to the Ebon Stories channel if you have not, because the ending of this story will blow your mind. And drop a comment below telling me what you think Arthur should do next. Over the next week, Arthur became consumed. He took vacation days from work, claiming an unexpected infrastructure problem that wasn't entirely a lie. He built detailed financial simulations, researched Massachusetts anti-usury statutes, and dove into Julian Vance's corporate history. What he found was a pattern that went far beyond Beatrice's father. Vance had been running the same scheme for decades. The failed bond deal had been one of many investment vehicles that had tanked under questionable management. Each time, small investors suffered huge losses, while Vance emerged with private cash and new opportunities to offer personal guarantees to desperate people trying to mitigate their exposure. It was ingenious in its brutality. Engineer the crisis, then profit from it by offering temporary relief that wasn't relief at all, but just different versions of the same trap. Arthur found 5 other civil suits filed against Vance over the years, all settled confidentially out of court with non-disclosure agreements. He found warnings on financial forms that had been scrubbed. He found a pattern of aggressive lending disguised as partnership with interest rates that should have been illegal, but were structured just carefully enough to exploit statutory gray areas. And he found something else, something that made him smile for the first time in days. Julian Vance was currently under investigation by the Massachusetts Securities Division. Not for the old guarantees. Those were technically complex, if morally bankrupt, but for a new private equity fund he'd launched in 2020. Someone had filed a complaint about undisclosed risk in the state. Regulators were quietly building a case. Arthur picked up his phone and called the number listed for the investigator handling the case. It went to voicemail. He left a detailed message explaining who he was and that he had documentation of Vance's liability practices going back 20 years. Then he hung up and waited. The call came back within 3 hours. The investigator's name was Marcus Chen, and he was very interested in what Arthur had to say. They met the next afternoon at a nondescript office building near Cambridge. Chen was in his mid-30s, methodical and intense with the demeanor of someone who'd spent years deconstructing corporate fraud. "Mr. Harrington," he said as they sat down with their folders, "you mentioned on your message that your wife has been making payments on a personal guarantee to Julian Vance for 20 years. Since 2006, I have all the receipts." Arthur pulled out the leather journal. Every payment documented. $960,000 paid on an original liability of $250,000. She still owes him $62,000. Chen's eyebrows went up. He pulled out several receipts, examining them carefully. "These are all certified checks, everyone." He insisted on checks in person every Wednesday, which means we have a bank trail of payments, but no record of the underlying transaction beyond these signed receipts. Chen smiled faintly, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. That's Vance's technique. Paper trails that are hard to interpret, hard to prove intent, hard to use against him. But this journal, he held one up to the light. "This is crucial, Mr. Harrington. This is exactly what I need. I don't understand. How is this different from the other deals he's made?" "Because of a legislative update. Massachusetts revised its Unfair and Deceptive Practices Act in 2008, specifically targeting certain types of personal guarantee renewals. Vance's initial agreement was in 2005 before the change. But here's the kicker. He renewed the terms in 2012. Chen pulled out one of the receipts from that year. "See this notation? Liability terms updated as per rider. That's a new contract, which means it falls under the 2008 laws. And under those laws, his interest structure is indefensible. Arthur felt something expand in his chest, hope sharp and powerful. So what does that mean? It means that every payment your wife made after 2012 was servicing a potentially unenforceable debt, which means those payments could be considered damages, which means Julian Vance might owe your wife a substantial reimbursement. Chen leaned forward. But I need your wife to testify. I need her to tell her story on the record as part of the investigation. Can she do that? Arthur thought about Beatrice, about the shame and exhaustion she'd been carrying for 20 years, about the way she'd protected him and their children by shouldering a burden that should never have been hers, about the look in her eyes when she'd finally told him the truth. She can do that, Arthur said. She's tougher than anyone realizes. Chen nodded. Then let's dismantle this scheme. The next Wednesday, Beatrice didn't go to the Sterling Tower. For the first time in 20 years, she stayed home at 9:51 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table with Arthur, reviewing her foundation proposal and waiting for her phone to ring. It rang at 10:05 a.m. Julian Vance, clears throat. Vance Industries. Beatrice stared at the screen, her hands steady. Answer it, Arthur said. On speaker, Beatrice accepted the call. Hello, Beatrice. Vance's voice was smooth, patrician, with an underlying tremor of urgency. You missed our transaction. Is there an issue? Everything's fine, Julian. I won't be meeting you anymore. A pause. I beg your pardon. I said I won't be meeting you anymore. No more payments. No more Wednesdays. We're finished. Beatrice, I don't think you grasp the severity of your obligation. You still owe me $62,000. If you breach this contract now, after all these years, I'm not breaching. I'm challenging a deceptive agreement. You updated the terms in 2012 under an interest structure that violates Massachusetts law, which means every payment I've made since then was on a void contract, which means you're going to reimburse me approximately $580,000. The silence on the other end was absolute. I don't know what fabrications you've been fed, Vance said finally, his voice colder now. But I suggest you consult a lawyer before making such inflammatory statements. I have counsel, Beatrice. Very aggressive counsel. If you try to challenge me on this, I will tie you up in litigation for a decade. You'll lose everything. No, Beatrice said, and Arthur heard a new powerful strength in her voice. You'll lose everything because I'm not challenging you alone anymore. My husband knows. The state investigators know. And they're very interested in your bond guarantee practices, Julian. All of them, going back decades. Another pause longer this time. When Vance spoke again, the smoothness was entirely gone. You're making a catastrophic error. The only error I made was letting you dictate my life for 20 years. That ends now. Beatrice hung up. Her hands were calm and she was smiling. For the first time in 2 decades, she'd told Julian Vance no. Arthur reached across the table and took her hand. How do you feel? Exhausted? Triumphant? Free? Beatrice laughed, a sound that was pure relief. What happens now? Now we wait for Chen to execute the plan. He's bringing in the full authority of the State Securities Division. They'll audit Vance's books, interview his other victims, build a case that he can't settle or intimidate his way out of. And if he comes after us, if he tries to, he won't, because anything he does now just confirms the pattern of abuse. He's too proud to admit he's caught. At least I hope he is. But Arthur underestimated Julian Vance's entitlement and his fear. Because men like Vance don't collapse quietly. They manipulate. They retaliate. They do whatever it takes to protect their reputation, even if it means destroying innocent people in the process. 4 days after Beatrice's phone call, Arthur came home from work to find their house had been disturbed. Nothing of value was missing. The art was still on the walls. Arthur's expensive watches were untouched. Their computer servers were right where they'd left them. But the antique desk in their study was open. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. Someone had been searching for evidence. The leather journal of receipts was gone. Arthur called Chen immediately. He took them. Vance took the journal. Are you certain it was him? Who else would want 20 years of payment records? He's attempting to erase the evidence. Chen was quiet for a moment. Mr. Harrington, do you still have the spreadsheet you built? The one with all the dates and amounts? Yes, but without the original receipts. But you digitally archived them, right? Before you met with me? Arthur froze. He hadn't. He'd been so focused on organizing the physical documents that he'd never thought to make encrypted backups. The only evidence of Beatrice's 20-year ordeal was now in Julian Vance's hands, probably feeding an industrial shredder in his coastal home. "We're exposed," Arthur said. "Without those receipts, we're not exposed. We're just going to have to be proactive." Chen's voice was sharp, determined. Vance made a severe mistake. Unlawful entry, theft of evidence in an active government investigation. That's felony territory. We'll secure warrants for his house, his office, his storage facilities. If he still has those receipts, we'll retrieve them. If he destroyed them, we'll establish spoliation of evidence. Either way, he just escalated the charges against himself. But Arthur knew it wasn't that simple. Vance had prestige, political contacts, lawyers who could frame a break-in as concerned creditor, retrieving misplaced documentation, or some other plausible narrative that would delay justice. They needed more than a burglary charge. They needed undeniable proof. They needed Vance to confess on record, and Arthur knew exactly how to facilitate that. "Chen," he said slowly, "what if Beatrice scheduled one more transaction, one final Wednesday meeting? What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing Vance is desperate right now. Desperate enough to break into our home. Desperate enough to destroy evidence. If Beatrice calls him, says she's had second thoughts, says she wants to make a compromise to keep this out of the press, he'll seize the opportunity. You want to use surveillance equipment? I want to record him admitting what he did, the illegal interest structure, the updated terms, the theft of the journal, everything. Get him to relax. Get him to feel superior. Get him to convict himself with his own words." Chen was quiet again. "That introduces substantial risk. If he suspects anything, he won't, because Beatrice will be convincingly anxious. She doesn't have to fake her apprehension. She's been afraid of him for 20 years. Arthur looked at Beatrice, who'd been listening to the entire conversation. She was pale, but her expression was one of absolute resolution. She nodded. "One more Wednesday," Beatrice said. "One final encounter, and then I'm done with Julian Vance permanently." Chen agreed to the plan with stringent protocols. Beatrice would wear a secure recording device, but Arthur would be nearby with backup personnel. The meeting would be in a semi-public location, not the tower, somewhere more remote where Vance might feel comfortable making threats. And at the slightest indication of danger, they'd intervene immediately. The next Wednesday couldn't arrive fast enough. And when it did, Arthur and Beatrice would walk into that meeting knowing that everything they'd built together, their trust, their marriage, their future, depended on what happened in the next hour. Julian Vance thought he'd secured victory by stealing those receipts. He thought he'd frightened them back into subservience. He thought wrong, because Arthur Harrington had spent 27 years married to the most resilient woman he'd ever known. And together they were about to show Julian Vance exactly what happened when you pushed a quiet, dedicated family too far. The contingency was in place. Wednesday was approaching, and Julian Vance's empire of financial predation was about to crumble around him. The Wednesday morning air was brisk and damp, early December, settling over Boston with that particular heavy stillness that hinted at a deep freeze. Beatrice sat in her car in the parking lot of the Harbor View Marina, a secluded spot on the outskirts of the North Shore. She'd suggested this location to Vance, somewhere discreet where we can finalize this without drawing attention, and he'd accepted instantly. Too instantly. Arthur had been correct. Vance was panicked. The microphone taped to Beatrice's torso felt cumbersome, though Chen had guaranteed her it was entirely concealed beneath her silk blouse. Arthur was parked 3 rows over in a surveillance van with Chen and 2 other state investigators monitoring every sound through Beatrice's device. 3 marked cruisers were positioned at the marina entrances, prepared to move in if necessary. Beatrice's phone vibrated, a text from Arthur. "You can abort this. We can find an alternative solution," she typed back. "No, I can't. For us, 20 years, remember?" At 9:51 a.m., Julian Vance's black Tesla pulled into the lot. Beatrice watched him get out, adjusting his bespoke suit, looking around the empty marina with the entitled composure of a man who'd never faced genuine accountability in his life. He walked toward her car, and Beatrice forced herself to get out and meet him midway. "Beatrice." Vance's handshake was firm, Solicitous, entirely performative. Thank you for your pragmatism. I knew we could resolve this like sophisticated adults. I'm not here for resolution, Julian. I'm here to clarify the terms of my surrender. His composure wavered slightly. What happens next is entirely dependent on your cooperation. Cease this regulatory folly, fulfill your remaining obligation as stipulated, and we can all conclude this episode. Continue this aggression. He smirked. Well, litigation is protracted, ruinously expensive, devastatingly stressful. I would hate to see you and Arthur lose your retirement fighting an unwinnable case. Unwinnable. You renewed an illegal liability. Julian, the law is unambiguous. Was unambiguous? Vance's smirk broadened. But records have a way of becoming unavailable, don't they? That journal you were so meticulous about. Where is it now? You broke into my home. Did I? Or did you simply misplace some outdated documents? These things occur. He stepped closer and Beatrice suppressed the instinct to retreat. Here is the reality, Beatrice. You've been paying me $4,000 a month for 20 years because you assumed the liability. You signed the documentation. You honored that commitment. And now, because your husband interfered and started making accusations, you think you can simply walk away. That's not how the financial world operates. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Beatrice's situation. Beatrice took a deep breath, remembering Chen's instructions. Keep him talking. Get him to confirm the specifics. The updated terms in 2012, that was after the Massachusetts law changed. You were fully aware the interest structure was indefensible then, weren't you? Indefensible is an exaggeration. The statute has always allowed for good faith interpretation. My legal team assured me the rider was compliant at 25% compounded quarterly. You consented to the terms, Beatrice. You could have sought external advice at any moment, could I? Because every time I mentioned consulting an attorney, you reminded me what would happen to my mother's property, to my brother's future inheritance. You maintained control through calculated fear. Vance's expression hardened. I maintained control. You came to me. Recall, you pleaded with me for an extension. I could have liquidated the entire estate immediately and buried your family in debt collection. Instead, I granted you a generous opportunity to service the obligation. If that feels like control to you, perhaps you should reevaluate your understanding of business ethics. Generosity, you've extracted $960,000 from me on a liability of $250,000 plus interest, plus maintenance fees, plus the considerable annoyance of receiving weekly checks for 20 years. Vance pulled out a crisp engraved card. But I am a merciful man, Beatrice. I am prepared to make this entire ordeal vanish. $62,000 delivered in full by the end of the month, and we conclude the matter. No more Wednesdays, no more involvement, no more liability. Just one final transaction, and you are released. Beatrice felt a cold clarity replacing her fear. Released. I've given you 20 years of my functional life, Julian. 20 years of supplemental employment. Concealing finances from my husband, lying to my family, 20 years of anxiety and guilt because my father placed misplaced trust in you, and you presume you can just take one more payment and we're even. I presume you have no viable alternative. Vance's voice became menacing, because without that journal, you have zero evidence. It is your unsubstantiated allegation against my documented corporate record, and my record, supported by my powerful network. My reputation, my capital will always prevail over the testimony of a part-time librarian from Concord. So, this is the arrangement. You will complete your final payment. You will instruct your husband to terminate this pointless endeavor. And you will inform those state regulators that your memory was flawed, that you misunderstood the complex financial terms. Do that, and this ends discreetly. Decline. He leaned in so close that Beatrice could feel his controlled breath. Decline, and I will dismantle you, your marriage, your livelihood, your good standing. I have connections, Beatrice. Municipal judges, state politicians, influential journalists. By the time I am finished, Arthur will believe you were secretly funding a personal extravagance for 20 years. Your children will read the accusations in the papers. Your mother will die knowing her daughter was a conspirator and a cheat. Is that the outcome you desire? Beatrice held his gaze. This man who'd exerted dominance over her for 2 decades. This man who'd capitalized on her father's demise, on her vulnerability, on her profound commitment to her family. And something inside her, something that had been compressed and tightly bound for 20 years, finally erupted. You know what, Julian? You are correct about one detail. I don't possess the journal anymore. You illegally seized it when you broke into my home. But here is the critical point you missed. Beatrice smiled, and it was genuine, fierce. You think you are the only one capable of gathering intelligence? You think you are the only one with technical expertise? My husband spent the last 2 weeks constructing a comprehensive forensic model that extends far beyond my father's liability. He located 5 other families you defrauded. He found corroborating evidence of your systematic pattern going back 30 years. And he provided all of it to the Massachusetts Securities Division. Vance's face went a shade of gray. You are attempting a deception. Am I? Marcus Chen sends his regards, by the way. He's deeply interested in your financial maneuvers, especially the new private equity fund you launched in 2020. It appears threatening small shareholders into accepting unacceptable risk is frowned upon by state regulators. Who could have predicted? You possess nothing. No journal, no case, no. I possess your admission. Beatrice tapped her chest right where the recorder was concealed. Every detail you just articulated, the intimidation, the unlawful entry, the illegal interest structure, all of it, captured, admissible. Checkmate, Julian. The color fled entirely from Vance's face. He stumbled backward, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot as if finally comprehending his environment. The unmarked van, the subtle patrol cars at the egress points, the entire apparatus closing around him. You orchestrated this. I elicited the truth from you. There is a meaningful difference. Beatrice raised her voice slightly. Did you acquire all the necessary dialogue? The van doors slid open. Marcus Chen stepped out, followed by Arthur and 2 plainclothes officers. They walked across the asphalt with the deliberate speed of individuals who had anticipated this very moment. Julian Vance, Chen said, displaying his identification. I am Special Investigator Marcus Chen with the Massachusetts Securities Division. We need to discuss your investment practices. Specifically, we need to discuss unlawful entry, theft of state's evidence, witness intimidation, and approximately 30 years of exploitative financial structuring. Vance looked at Beatrice, and for the first time since she'd met him 18 years ago, she saw something other than smug confidence in his eyes. She saw pure, naked terror. You have no comprehension of the forces you have activated, he said hoarsely. Do you have any idea how influential my associates are, the legal teams I retain? You believe this is concluded, but it is merely the opening. I will bankrupt you in court for years. You will initiate nothing, Arthur said, stepping forward. He'd been silent until now, allowing Beatrice her confrontation, but his voice carried an intensity that halted Vance mid-threat. Because your associates, your legal teams, they won't assist you when the state brings criminal charges. They won't assist you when the other families you victimized join the prosecution. And they certainly won't assist you when every financial news outlet in Boston reports on the disgraced investor who made his fortune preying on grieving widows and elderly clients. Chen signaled to the officers, Mr. Vance, we require you to accompany us. You are not yet formally detained, but we have questions that demand immediate answers. I recommend your complete cooperation. As the officers escorted Vance to an unmarked SUV, he looked back at Beatrice one last time. This is a profound mistake. No, Beatrice said quietly. It is the end of yours. They watched the SUV drive away, Vance's profile grim through the tinted window. Beatrice felt Arthur's hand grasp hers, warm and comforting and absolutely real. You were flawless, he said. I was absolutely petrified. You were both. He pulled her into a tight embrace, and Beatrice allowed herself to finally sag into him, allowed herself to feel the profound weight of 20 years dissipating from her shoulders. Chen walked over, removing his earpiece. We secured every piece of required dialogue. The admission clears throat alone is sufficient to commence prosecution. Add in the attempted evidence destruction, the intimidation, and the forensic work your husband performed. She smiled. Julian Vance is going to face severe consequences for the next few years. What is the immediate outcome? Beatrice asked. Now we consolidate the case. Interview the other victims your husband identified. Conduct a full audit of Vance's corporate records. It will require patience, but I am confident we can establish a pattern of financial abuse that spans decades. Regarding your specific claim, Chen pulled out a detailed summary. Based on what we have recorded, I believe you are entitled to a complete reimbursement of all payments made after the 2012 renewal. That amounts to approximately $580,000, plus potentially more if we can demonstrate actionable coercion in the initial guarantee. $580,000. Beatrice felt momentary vertigo. I never imagined I'd recover any of it. Believe it, individuals like Vance construct their fortunes on the assumption that people like you will remain silent. You decisively proved that assumption false. Chen closed the folder. It will take time to adjudicate everything through the legal channels, but I will provide regular updates on our progress. In the meantime, go home. Reconnect with your family. Discontinue your visits to downtown Boston on Wednesday mornings. Beatrice laughed, a sound that was part relief, part astonishment, part joy. I believe I can manage that adjustment. The next few months passed in a flurry of legal motions, depositions, and media attention. The story was first published in the Boston Globe. High-profile investor implicated in decades-long predatory liability scheme. By the end of the week, every major news outlet in New England was running versions of the story. Reporters staked out Vance's coastal home, photographing the massive estate auction sign that appeared on his property. His private equity firm lost 3 major clients within days. His exclusive club membership was formally rescinded. But the most satisfying moment came 8 weeks later when Beatrice and Arthur sat in a federal courtroom in Boston and watched Julian Vance stand before a magistrate to answer formal charges. Criminal usury, wire fraud, witness tampering, corporate malfeasance. The list was extensive. Each charge carried substantial potential prison time. Vance's legal team had utilized every tactic: motions to dismiss, claims of entrapment, arguments about the chain of custody for the recorded conversation. Nothing succeeded. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too ingrained, the admission too definitive. The judge set bail at $750,000. Vance's expression watching him realize he'd have to liquidate core assets just to avoid immediate incarceration pending trial was something Beatrice would never forget. Outside the courthouse, Chen pulled them aside. I have a communication. The federal prosecutor is extending Vance a plea agreement. If he consents to surrender his investment license permanently, pay full restitution to all identified victims, and accept a deferred sentence with strict 7-year probation, they will drop the most serious charges. What does that imply for us? Arthur asked. It implies you would receive your money significantly faster. Full restitution, $580,000, plus the $62,000 in outstanding liability that was deemed non-existent. Total of $642,000. It would be processed within 90 days rather than waiting years for a protracted federal trial to conclude. Beatrice looked at Arthur. They'd anticipated this possibility, the strategic choice between maximum penalty and practical recovery. What about the other families? They would all receive full restitution as well. 6 families total, nearly $3 million recovered. Vance would be financially ruined, but would avoid maximum security prison. And if we reject the agreement, we proceed to trial. Could take 3 years, potentially more. Vance might face incarceration, but recovery of funds becomes substantially more difficult. His assets could be tied up in complex appeals indefinitely. Beatrice thought about Julian Vance in prison, thought about the visceral satisfaction of seeing him confined. Then she thought about the other families, people who'd suffered just like her, waiting years for justice that might never fully materialize. Accept the agreement, Beatrice said. Ensure everyone receives their recovery. That is the paramount objective. Chen nodded. I will communicate your decision to the prosecutor. You are making a courageous choice. 4 months later, on a Wednesday morning, the symbolism felt divinely orchestrated. Beatrice received a wire transfer for $642,000. She and Arthur sat at the kitchen table, staring at their brokerage account statement, watching the number that had seemed impossible become reality. "What is the plan for this?" Beatrice asked. Arthur had already developed several models. Our children's graduate school debt, retire it immediately, bolster our retirement fund, schedule that expedition we've been postponing for 20 years, and perhaps he reached across the table to take her hand. Perhaps we utilize some of it to assist other individuals caught in predatory agreements like yours. Families dealing with usurious liabilities. People who are unaware of their legal rights. Beatrice smiled. A charitable foundation? Like a legitimate organization? Why not? You spent 20 years supporting a predator. Now you can spend the next 20 empowering his victims. The concept gained momentum rapidly. Within 8 months, the Sterling Foundation for Financial Empowerment was formally chartered, funded partially by Beatrice's recovery and partially by contributions from the other families Vance had victimized. They retained legal experts to provide pro bono consultations for individuals dealing with deceptive loan agreements. They developed educational workshops about financial literacy and predatory lending indicators. They collaborated with Chen and other state agencies to identify and report other schemes before they could ensnare families the way Vance had entrapped the Sterlings. Beatrice discovered a profound talent for this work: the advocacy, the public education, the patient labor of helping people understand their rights and find their voice. She'd spent 20 years concealing. Now she stood in front of university groups and community centers and professional seminars telling her story, ensuring other people knew they didn't have to bear their burdens in isolation. As for Julian Vance, the plea agreement meant he avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but his life as he defined it was annihilated. His investment empire collapsed. His mansion sold at a massive loss to cover restitution payments. His reputation was irrevocably damaged. The last Arthur heard, Vance was working as a compliance officer at a minor insurance firm in Providence, living in a cramped rental apartment, driving a decade-old sedan. Not prison, but a more subtle form of consequence. The persistent indignity of mundane existence after decades of feeling invincible. One evening, nearly 2 years after that final Wednesday at the marina, Beatrice and Arthur sat on their renovated deck, watching the last light fade over their yard. They'd settled all their children's financial obligations. They'd completed a month-long trip through Southeast Asia. They'd updated the plumbing and repaired the roof and done all the maintenance they'd been neglecting. But primarily they'd communicated, truly communicated about commitment and deception and the consequence of shouldering grief alone. "Do you truly forgive me?" Beatrice asked softly, "for the 2 decades of omission?" Arthur was silent for a prolonged period. "I understand your rationale. I understand you were motivated by protection. But Beatrice, we are a partnership. We are meant to confront challenges together. You denied me that opportunity." "That right. I know. But I also know that you bore an intolerable pressure with grace and resilience. I cannot even begin to comprehend. You shielded our family when you believed I lacked the capacity for the truth. That does not validate the deception, but it renders it forgivable." He turned to look at her. "So yes, I forgive you, provided you promise. No further secrets, no further protection from difficult realities. We confront every challenge together from this moment onward." "Agreed." Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder. "I regret that it took me so long to trust you with this truth. I regret that I was so preoccupied. I should have recognized your suffering. You recognized it when it was absolutely necessary. That is the only measure that matters." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars emerge over Concord. The same stars that had observed Beatrice's 20 years of silent struggle. Her weekly trips to a high-rise office. Her quiet acts of self-sacrifice that were unknown until they became known. But now those Wednesdays were simply memories. The liability was absolved. The predator was defeated. And Beatrice was liberated to live the life she'd deferred for 2 decades. Sometimes the most profound victory isn't retribution. It's the refusal to be destroyed by the people who attempted to break you. It's the transformation of your pain into purpose and your struggle into strength. It's the refusal to allow your narrative to conclude with defeat and instead writing a new chapter where the targets become the champions and the vulnerable become the vigilant. Beatrice had mastered that lesson through arduous experience. Now she would dedicate the rest of her life teaching it to others. And every time she assisted someone in confronting their own Julian Vance, clears throat. Every time she witnessed a family reclaim their financial autonomy from a predator, she'd recall that chilly December morning at the marina. When she finally vocalized no, when she finally prioritized her own freedom, when she finally understood that the highest expression of love is not silent suffering. It is trusting the people you love with your entire truth. That was her enduring legacy, not the debt, not the deception, not the 20 years of Wednesdays, but the courage to stop hiding, to face her deepest fear, and to construct something meaningful from the wreckage of what Julian Vance had attempted to demolish. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the Ebon Stories channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next.